2021. I can't believe it's already 2021. We are going to be broadcasting live via YouTube. And I'd like to welcome all the participants, all the CAG members, as well as Tom Stevenson, the IAASB chair, Lynn Dewey, the deputy chair, and Galen Hansen, the IAASB CAG chair. So welcome all of you. In addition, we have the PIOB observer, Dr. Chen, welcome. And two official observers, Ms. Barb Vanich of PCOB and George Kamwe of the IMF. So welcome to you as well. We do have a few apologies and we appreciate everyone letting us know. But before we start the formal presentation, I did want to give a chance for Tom, if you have any remarks for the CAG, if you'd like to make them.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on sort of an off-schedule event. It's really important, though, that we meet with you today because next week we will be gathering as a board, some of us in person, to discuss the fraud project proposal. And so this is an important input before we reach conclusion on that project proposal at the board. We will certainly value every bit of feedback we get today. The fraud project is important because it goes to the core of our strategy about taking on the most important emergent public interest issues. And as I've said many times, in almost every conversation that I have, this topic comes up, what we're going to do about it. It's also really important from my perspective because it is in many ways a first in that we used our information gathering activities of our framework for activities really to guide our work here, that we've also benefited from our new public interest framework, even though it's not formally implemented as part of the MG recommendations, but as you see from the proposal that we drew on it heavily, and that not that we haven't done this in the past, but when you take those first two things together, we were in a much better position to focus on the public interest objectives. And you could see the flow from public interest objectives to specific issues that come as a result. And so I think the task force and the team have done a great job in bringing this package together. And our hope is because of all the work that we've done up front, that we will be able to proceed in a very tightly focused manner that gets to a really good outcome. And the big thing to remember is that our project, while we don't have preconceived outcomes about where we're going, the basis of our deliberations, that we are going to be ambitious in solving the emerging issues as it relates to fraud. So thank you, Jim, and thank you to the CAG for being willing to provide input to us today that will be most useful for us next week.
Thank you, Tom. I'd also like to call in Billy, the technical director of IAASB, to see if you have any comments. Billy?
Thank you, Jim. And I think the only thing I'll add to what Thomas already said is, I think you will remember that after the July meeting of the board, we actually took the decision to delay the project proposal by 3 months to buy ourselves an extra quarter. And I must say, looking back at that, I really do think it was the right decision. It really gave the task force the chance to go back to the comprehensive information gathering and research that we've done, to revisit some of the issues and some of the proposed actions, and to pull everything together in a project proposal, which in essence is a little bit different from project proposals that we've done in the past. Because of the information gathering and research that we went through, we were able to be much more specific in identifying the issues that we need to address and the possible actions to address those issues, as well as incorporating elements of the public interest framework that Lynn will talk to in a little bit more detail. And it's also important that, we've kept CAG informed about this throughout the whole process with the discussions we had in September last year, in March of this year, as well as in September this year, where we also shared initial views on the elements of the project proposal that we are bringing to you today. So very much looking forward to CAG representatives' input. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Billy. And in our last meeting, we did talk a little bit about minutes. And the good news is I wanted to see if anyone had any comments on the minutes from the September 2021 public session or the September 21 joint session. Otherwise, we will go ahead and have those approved. Any comments on the minutes? All right, and thank you for having those minutes so quickly. We appreciate that. And I do get to have the esteemed duty of talking about Zoom protocol. I'm sure a few of you have been on a few Zoom calls in the last 2 years, but in case you've forgotten, if you have a comment that you want to bring to the table, please raise your hand. Once you've been called upon, please lower your hand. And most importantly, please stay on mute when you're not speaking. So thank you for following that. And I did want to talk about this fraud project proposal because I think it's one of the very important proposals, and for a couple of reasons. One is it really focuses on some of the public interest issues. Secondly, it was developed through the IAASB framework of activities, and we've talked extensively about the framework of activities and how that process works in terms of gathering research, identifying issues and challenges, and how that moves through the process. So Lynn's going to give us a lot more detail on that, but I just wanted everyone to know that it did go through the framework of activities. And lastly, this discussion is really focused on, I think from a CAG perspective, what we think in terms of the proposed direction of the project and whether it really reflects public interest issues and how they will be addressed. So with that entry, Lynn, I know it's very early on your side of the world, but we're very happy that you're able to join us, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jim, and hello, everybody. I hope you're not suffering too much from Zoom fatigue, but I think it's certainly becoming a feature of all of our lives. Today, I want to give you an overview of the activities that the working group have done since September, then talk about some of the aspects of the project proposal, and very importantly, get your views on that draft project proposal, which was circulated before the meeting. Since September, the PIOB has updated its public interest list as late as November the 10th this year, and fraud remains an area of focus, as Tom said. And they highlighted in those interests the importance of strengthening the auditor's responsibilities within 240 and also the identification and reporting of fraud. Before I leave this slide, I just want to reinforce that as we go forward with this project, which will hopefully be approved at the December meeting of the IAASB, we do intend to keep in contact with all stakeholder groups so that we can make sure that our areas of concern are clearly understood with what's happening in the environment and that our solutions are workable. Moving on, Michelle. This slide talks about the extensive information gathering and research that we have done. I've already talked about this with you in previous meetings, but in the blue box, we have had a discussion paper, we've had roundtables, we've analysed the responses, and we have done a thorough review of relevant academic research. One of the things that we heard from the discussion paper responses was that people wanted us to do more work on root causes of recent frauds to see whether there were any other issues. And in the March CAG session, it was also highlighted that it would be useful to do this work. So we have indeed completed some further fraud cause root analysis work, and that has included targeted outreach, some academic review of specific recent fraud cases, and other analysis of publicly available information. It's probably worth noting that, of course, some of the more recent fraud cases are before the courts and there isn't a lot of information available, but we did use what was publicly available. And the findings of this work further substantiates the objectives and scope of the project being proposed. There were a few interesting things that arose, but generally it reinforced what we already knew. Next slide, please. And the common themes that we found from the root cause analysis are up on the screen now. Staff did this work. They met with a variety of individuals, some of them representing police commissioners, audit oversight authorities, and firms, often the individuals which had global roles. Some of the key takeaways from the root cause analysis were that each fraud is unique and often complex, and there are often many or more than one contributing factors. Issues relating to fraud need to be addressed through a combined standard setting effort of the IAASB, as well as action by all participants in the financial reporting ecosystem. Corporate culture and internal controls are key aspects of fraud prevention and detection, and I know we had that discussion at the last CAG meeting. Exercising professional skepticism in identifying and investigating red flags is critical, and we have added some work in this area, in these two areas, because they're identified as important drivers. One was non-material fraud, that frauds often start small and then grow to being material. So we had initially decided we wouldn't do any more work on non-material fraud. We've added it back to the proposal. Likewise with third-party fraud, there are a number of countries where that is a significant issue. So we have added that back into the proposal. Next slide, please. Okay, we have set out in the project proposal 4 project objectives, and we have leveraged off the IAASB's public interest framework, as Billy said. While the PIF is not effective yet, it will be by the time this project is complete. Thus, we thought it was prudent to incorporate it into our proposal at the outset, as it allows for a better assessment at the conclusion as to whether the objectives achieve the public interest. The PIF also sets out qualitative characteristics to assess a project's responsiveness to the public interest. These characteristics include scalability, relevance, comprehensiveness, clarity and conciseness, implementability, and the ability of being consistently applied and globally applicable and enforceable. We intend to take these characteristics into consideration throughout the project as we advance towards the exposure draft. The objectives outlined on the slide effectively capture the IAASB's responses to the stakeholders' needs, that is the public interest, and have been identified in our information gathering and research processes. Next slide, please. These are the 5 stakeholder groups that are identified in this PIF, and we have used those without any change because we believe that they are appropriate. Just to note that in soliciting the views from stakeholders, we have to consider all of the input of differing stakeholders that will affect the overall objectives, then appropriately weigh that input in terms of the public interest impact of the various stakeholders, and make sure that our response reflects that balanced view. Next slide, please. I'm pausing for a sec while I load my second lot of slides. Okay, this slide is the crux of the project proposal. We'll get to that in a minute. So we have identified the key issues that need to be addressed in this project, and they have been discussed at both CAG and the IAASB over the last couple of years. And as I've already said, they are key matters that arose in the other work we have done as well. Just pausing on a couple of those, being very clear about the role of the auditor in an audit of financial statements and promoting consistent behaviour among those auditors is one of the vital parts of this project, as is, and we have absolute unanimity around this, updating the standard in terms of identifying and assessing risk and the actions to be taken from them. I'll go through some of these in a little bit more as I address some of our proposals for the project. Next slide, please. We have 3 tools that we can use in terms of the IAASB. Our primary tool is, of course, standard setting. As well as that, we can produce non-authoritative guidance, and there are a range of other actions which, in terms of this project proposal, largely revolve around education and communication. And we have used all of the feedback that we got on our initial proposals that we have discussed at the various meetings in preparing this proposal and to coming to these key points. Instead of going through the entire proposal, I intend to concentrate on the matters previously raised by CAG and what we intend to do about them. So looking firstly at that dark blue column, column 1, refining the roles and responsibilities of the auditor, as I've already said, has come out as a really important element of this project. We are proposing to do standard setting activity to enhance the introductory paragraphs to emphasise the auditor's responsibility on fraud. You'll remember that the current 240 emphasises the limitations rather than the responsibilities. We are not intending to change the definition of fraud, but we are certainly looking to enhance application material to explain how concepts such as bribery and corruption interact with fraud. And finally, in this regard, we have a section on determining whether and how forensic specialists can and should be used. The project includes proposals to include requirements and application material to address the need for specialised skills to assist with audit fraud procedures, including consideration of when this might be appropriate. Moving on to the second column, and it was highlighted to us that we should highlight by CAG that we should highlight the importance of external auditors liaising with internal auditors. And we have included this in standard setting activities to incorporate the recent changes to 315, emphasising that in entity-specific control activities to prevent and detect fraud, and updating the fraud risk factors in the appendix. And we will also be preparing some non-authoritative guidance which illustrates how 240 should be applied within the full suite of ISAs, and that includes 610 on internal audit. Another issue that was raised with us by CAG was making sure that we maintain a robust principle-based statement and that we reinforce the auditor's exercise of professional skepticism. And as you can see in column 3, we are emphasising that in the project, and hope that by an emphasis on the roles and responsibilities of the auditor, by enhancing the risk-based assessments and reinforcing professional skepticism, we will do all of that at the level of principles, not at the level of detailed rules. In the second column, we also have added technology. This was the second biggest theme we heard was please update this standard for the new technology. We have proposed that we will do that within the limits of what one can do without having things that age too much in terms of technology, and that we will certainly use the technology consultation group and potentially a technical expert to do that work. We also received feedback from CAG to think about the incorporation of a standback where the auditor considers all the facts and looks at the big picture before completing an audit. We think that the activities in the risk assessment, identification and assessment area could include a standback, and also contribute to professional skepticism by looking at collaborative and contradictory evidence in that regard. And finally, to column 4, to enhance transparency, we are suggesting a serious strengthening of communication with those charged with governance as it relates to fraud procedures performed, and making sure that communication is throughout the audit, not just at the end. I want to highlight transparency in the auditor's report about fraud-related matters. As I briefed you last time, views diverge on the need for more transparency in the auditor's report, including different views on how this could be done for those that do support more transparency in the auditor's report. The working group acknowledges the importance of this issue, and as such has included in the project proposal an action to further explore the need for more transparency in the auditor's report, and if so, how this could be done, and this might include further outreach with investor groups and other relevant stakeholders. Although there were lots of comments received about the IAASB's role in narrowing the expectation gap, this is not a focus of this project. Having said that, the substantial standard setting actions proposed will help the IAASB play its part in narrowing the gap. Some other actions we might undertake include highlighting the auditor's role and responsibilities in the financial reporting ecosystem through activities of a more educational nature, for example, webinars and other communication tools, and encouraging engagement with other players in the ecosystem. Other areas that were highlighted by the CAG representatives include when non-material fraud is suspected or identified, the presumed risk of revenue recognition, and the auditor's considerations for external confirmations. These are all included in the project proposal. Next slide, please. At the back of the project proposal, we have considered the impact of the proposal of the fraud project, and there are 3 areas that we think we will have impact and measured as on the screen. We expect that by enhancing 240, we will have more robust risk identification and assessment processes and effective responses to those risks. We will have the appropriate exercise of professional skepticism in fraud-related audit procedures, and we will enhance transparency through communicating with those charged with governance and reporting on fraud-related procedures. So that is a very quick run through of what we have in the project proposal. I do commend the proposal to you and look forward to your views. Next slide, please. On the objectives, the key issues, and the scope of the proposal, and anything else you would like to bring to our attention. As you can see from this briefing, we do appreciate your input and we do take it seriously. Thank you very much. Jim, back to you.
Thank you, Lynn. And I think we will get ready for some questions. So if you could, my fellow CAG members, raise their hand, and I will be happy to get this started. I can't believe we have a quiet bunch this morning, this afternoon. Paul.
Okay, and again, remembering that there are 3 Pauls, I think I'm the only one who raised my hand. First of all, I'd like to say, thank you, Lynn. I think you did a good job of listening to the input provided at the last meeting and addressing things appropriately. I'm very encouraged by the direction of this project, fully support the objective and scope. 2 minor comments. I note that technology is something that has been brought up, and I know you're going to cover it. It occurred to me that technology, there's really kind of 2 aspects of it. One is the impact of technology on perhaps enabling fraud, but the other is the auditor's ability to utilize technology to possibly more easily detect indicators of fraud. Again, I assume that's something that would be covered both sides of it. And then finally, a little bit of a plug that might be relevant. I'd mentioned at the last meeting that COSO has a fraud risk management guide that we published with the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. We are actually in the process of updating that. I expect that update to be out sometime in maybe second quarter-ish of 2022. And one of the key updates will be having more emphasis on technology, the impact technology can have on frauds, et cetera, possibly even a mini case study. So when that comes out, I certainly encourage you to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Jim.
Wait, Lynn, you're taking my job away from me. Thank you, Paul. Paul Sobel, to be more precise. Let's see. Anyone else have any comments? Akito.
Thank you.
You're on.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I appreciate tremendous efforts of working group. I support the direction of the project proposal, and I'd like to share 5 points. The first point is an overall comment. There are many key issues identified and addressed by the project. If the auditor is overburdened as a result of the revise, this may result in insufficient application of professional skepticism. Such a balance needs to be kept in mind. The second point is also an overall comment. Historically, the discussion about auditors' responsibility for fraud has always started with a discussion of what the auditor is not responsible for before talking about what the auditor's responsibilities are. I think that it is very important and would help address the expectation gap if the project and related discussion started with and remained focused on what the auditor is responsible for. This can be very important in keeping the appropriate professional skepticism and appropriate response to fraud risk factors if the auditor remains grounded in what their responsibilities are rather than what their responsibilities are not. The third point is my suggestion. In the fraud risk response standards in Japan, it is clearly stated that the status of response to fraud risk and fraud or suspected fraud by management and employees who play important roles in internal controls, etc., shall be appropriately taken over when the auditor is changed. Given the current situation of a certain number of takeover of audit works, it may be necessary to add this point to the project proposal of fraud. The next fourth point is my concern regarding in the part of 4, requirements and application material, risk identification and assessment stated of the project proposal stated considering examples in ISA 240 to illustrate the scalability of requirements. For example, by providing examples that are more relevant to less complex entities, LCEs. Since IS4 LCE is a separate audit standard, including the wording of LCE in ISA 240 should be refrained from, as it would lead to misleading that the cross-referencing is possible to auditors. The last point is my observation regarding extending the existing written representations on fraud. It is important to inform auditors about the communication with audit clients in advance, as it is essential for clients to understand and respond to additional actions in advance, in particular in the group audit. These are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akihito. And I am getting some background noise, so someone may be shuffling papers. So if you could be sure that you're on mute, we'd appreciate that so we can get the best clarity from the speakers. And Akihito, you also mentioned something that I think had come up at the CAG before, is the focus on what the auditors should do versus what the auditors should not be responsible for. So I appreciate that. Lynn, I'm just going to get some more questions, or would you like to? Okay. Hilda.
Good evening it is for me. So thank you very much for the presentation, Lynn. And as you know, Council Europe did a project on fraud and recommendations to strengthen the financial reporting ecosystem related to this. So we actually recognize quite a few matters that we had already considered in that project. So overall, we're very supportive of the proposals and the project proposal that you have just commented on in your presentation. A few comments or questions. Maybe we already said it before, but when we started on our fraud project, we started off from, looking at the scope of audit and then focusing on fraud, and we also focused separately on going concern. And very quickly we realized that actually we couldn't just focus on the audit. We had to focus on the whole financial reporting ecosystem and have a holistic approach and look at the role of the different stakeholders related to fraud. And it's a little bit like the stakeholders that you have highlighted in your slide 5, but not as getting their responses to the proposals, but also to look at their role, because it is not only the auditor that can actually address the fraud issues. You have to have companies and management and boards and audit committees also look into this, and you have to have regulators, standard setters, and others also play their role. And as you're looking into this also as far as non-authoritative guidance and other actions. The question was, is this something that you will also reflect on? We obviously understand that this is an ISA, this is a standard, so this is an audit standard, and there are limits to how you can address the responsibilities of other parties. But we think it is in fraud and fraud detection and identification and assessment so important that there is a need also to refer to or to think about the role of other stakeholders. So a question on how you think the IAASB can play its role there. And then we have 2 other considerations related to more the specifics in what you are proposing. One is related to professional skepticism. It was already referred to. We fully appreciate that the ISAs are principles based, but if you refer to the appropriate exercise of professional judgment, we're full supportive to look at that, but to have clarity on what would be the characteristics that really need to be considered around this would be considered to be quite useful. And then related to transparency, fully supportive again, that's very important. You refer to those charged with governance, to the auditor's report. Obviously, there are potentially, it's almost like a decision tree. If you report to those charged with governance, but if there is no response to them, then what is the next step? Is it immediately into the audit report that you would see the impact of this, or is there other considerations that actually can be considered? So, as far as transparency, as far as communication, to have almost like we have in NOCLAR, a bit more clarity on the decision tree where you go, it's a yes or no, depending on the reactions you get, could be considered as quite useful. So these are my questions or comments, and looking very much forward to your responses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hilda. Wei, you have your hand up.
Oh, thanks, Jim. Thanks for the length presentation. And I appreciate the work has been done by the working group. And the working group has listed a series of CAG observations during the root cause analysis efforts, which were shown on slide 3, such as how the frauds were eventually detected and by whom. The observation poses a good question on the role of auditor in detecting fraud. I noticed that external auditors typically identify few frauds. It is natural we want to know who typically identify more fraud cases and why auditors cannot detect those frauds which were reported by others. As an audited financial statement reader, we expect the statement is reliable and auditors are able to identify majority material financial statement frauds. The observation from the root cause analysis further supports the needs to address expectation gap among the stakeholders in the financial ecosystem, and also addressing performance gap of auditors in detecting fraud in the audits of financial statements. So the working group has already pointed out possible actions which can be addressed by the project, and I support the direction it takes. I agree with the suggestions to reinforce the exercise of professional skepticism and to enhance the transparency on fraud-related procedures in auditor reports. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei. Galen, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Jim. So thank you very much for the presentation from the task force. Very, very much. I think it was really right on point. I want to follow. I'll make my comments fairly brief. Akito, I really appreciated his comments on the importance to clarify the responsibility with respect to fraud. In my career, I've testified in court as an expert, and it's just astounding the number of members of the profession, whether you're talking about an audit partner or a staff person at all levels, just really not a clear understanding of what their responsibilities are, and in some cases denying any responsibility to detect fraud. I think it would be very helpful, regardless of where the task force comes down on that question, as to clarify
Galen, you seem to be fading
what
out.
that responsibility is, and sort of a subset of that when a situation arises where a friend, I'll try talking a little bit louder, in situations where it is deemed appropriate a forensic audit, that it'd be important that be clarified as well, in the sense of that part of the financials, does it become part of the financial statement audit, or is it a non-attest services unrelated to the financial statement audit? Lastly, I might add, Jim, I hope you can hear me okay, but about 10 years ago, in the US, there was a Treasury Committee recommendation about establishing a fraud center, and not really to commit, rather to exchange information on frauds that are occurring between firms. That recommendation was never acted upon. And I wonder if that might be an opportunity for IFAC or others to look at that, to reconsider the idea of having an ability to exchange information on what's happening maybe in the cyber world as well, and to help firms talk to one another to really get their arms around frauds as they are occurring, rather than and addressing them proactively as opposed to after the fact. But thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Galen. And yeah, that's a good point on the cyber fraud. That might be an emerging front when we talk about technology in a sense. Paul, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Jim. Yep, again, from our side at EFA, strong support for the project and its direction. I listened with interest at Akihito's remarks and couldn't agree more. I don't think I'm alone in agreeing with what Akihito said, especially with regard to the positive description of the auditor's responsibilities. You know, for too long now, we've kept banging away at we are not responsible for X, Y, Z. I think it's just much more favorable for all concerned, including ourselves, the profession, to say here's what we are responsible for and couch it in more positive terms. Not least because generally the communication, the transparency around our role, our responsibilities is key. I was also happy to hear Akihito's remarks with regard to the need to ensure scalability, especially if we're to provide examples. Some of those examples need to be of smaller and simpler, less complex entities. And then, of course, does beg the question, given the project underway right now to develop a separate standalone standard, ISA, for less complex entities, can we expect that standard to anticipate and incorporate any changes that are made to the requirements within the body of the ISA? Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Paul. That's an interesting question as we go down this LCE path and as we address standard, the implication for both sets, if you will. Very, very interesting. Daniel.
Thank you, Jim. I just have a little concern. I think it's a very, very well-structured project. But I was thinking, depending on the regulation, there are some jurisdictions where the assessment of fraud is a more encompassing element than that considered in ISA 240, especially when it comes, for example, to a statutory audit that also has an opinion on the financial statements that is often common in some countries. I wonder if it is possible to include in this amendment to ISA 240 some comments about cases when an expanded assessment of fraud is required. I think it could be useful. And it goes in the same line that Paul and another have come before. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. That's a good question. What if you do find fraud? What are the next steps? Tara.
Hi, all. Apologies for being late today. Just in terms of my area of practice and setting actuarial reserves and using professional judgment, I think that's also an area that's ripe for fraud. You know, if a company or entity is going to potentially hide or obscure data that might change the way you develop your estimate, I think that also should be very much included in the discussion, the examples, that kind of thing. And apologies if this was covered previously, but I didn't see it in the pre-read. So I want to make sure we cover that as well.
Thank you, Tara. It was not. So, and those are some very large numbers. So that is a topic. Lynn, there's some more hands. Do you want me to continue on, or do you want to respond? Oops. Lynn, you may be on mute. There you go.
Okay, sorry. Jim, keep going, and because there are some common themes coming through, so I'll comment when we've got everybody's input. Thanks.
Okay, great. Natasha, how are you?
Great, thank you. Sorry to take a bit of time to unmute. I guess I just wanted to echo, I think, a point made by Wei Meng earlier, and this is a point that I've made before, but just for the record, you know, I do struggle with framing this as an expectation gap. I think we really are trying to focus here on, you know, the positive role of auditors, the fact that they are stepping up and saying these are our responsibilities. And I think the reason we're doing that is because there has been a delivery gap. And I find, you know, if you know, in a way, the expectation gap is slightly sort of diverting attention away from that and almost placing the blame, you know, or the responsibility on people having the wrong expectations, rather than the fact that we need to get a better, you know, more professional skepticism and a better audit and do a better job in this area. So that's one point, and I think, you know, the stronger that comes across, the better. So I would really urge the use of delivery gap as often as expectation gap, at the very least. The other point I was going to make was just to pick up on the point just made before me, I think, which is, do you know, where does misrepresentation become fraud? And in a sense, all of this is just about, you know, kind of intentional, and obviously it's a more extreme form, but it is, you know, a kind of intentional misrepresentation to kind of deceive, and knowingly doing that. And, you know, in a way, all of the kind of principles here that we're talking about are ones that should be, and are to a certain extent, you know, emphasized for absolutely every aspect of the work that's being done in all areas. So, you know, the actuarial reserves we're just hearing about, you know, I would say any judgment, any judgmental assumption, you know, would require that level of professional skepticism. And you could almost say if those assumptions are being, you know, aggressive, if they're aggressive, etc., then in a way that's kind of an attempt to deceive. So I guess this is maybe, you know, the broader point being that, you know, this professional skepticism and any strengthening that we do here, that we should be seeing this throughout. And so again, you know, perhaps any innovations, greater transparency that we're seeing here should be applied throughout, because that, you know, because it is relevant throughout. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. I also think it brings up the question of intent. It's very hard for auditors to prove intent. And certainly that would have to go through the court system, and before it actually is considered fraud, versus a situation that maybe where fraud may exist. And so that's an interesting set of questions. Let's see. Daniel, did your hand still up, or did you have an additional comment?
Jim, you're talking to me?
Yes, Daniel S.
No, I thought I was put my hand on low, but
okay. And I apologize, I don't have a name. It says simply Zoom user. So I will recognize if you have your hand up and your name is Zoom user. Go ahead. You have to unmute first. There you go.
Oh, James, sorry. This is George Cowboy.
Hey, George.
Hi. Thank you. I just wanted to reemphasize that we're very supportive of this initiative, and I wanted to make a very specific point. I see that there are proposals for considerations for requirements and application on the need for specialized skills, and that there will be a new requirement for when an auditor considers that this is required. I think this will be a very critical point. And I also wonder how it is that we are going to have a pretty robust set of criteria that would enable us to be on safe ground, because this is an area that I think would be ripe for Monday morning quarterbacking if there were issues to emerge after the fact. And why did the auditor not invoke this particular requirement? So just perhaps a question of emphasis on this particular point, but I think it's a critical point. Thank you.
Great, thank you, George. And anyone else with any comments at this point? I think I'd like to add two more, Len, and they may be detailed comments. So the first one is, and I didn't see it on the project key areas, is one is to look at the old procedures and the effectiveness of the old procedures. If there's going to be a revision to 240, if maybe some of the old way of doing things has been determined not to be as effective as it was thought when it was issued. And then the second one, you referenced the stand back as part of risk assessment, which to me makes sense. But there's also conflicting information. If there's a conflicting report out there that alleges fraud, and how that would be addressed. So I think that represents all the comments we have at this point. And I will turn it back to you. You got a lot of information there, so go ahead.
Thank you all very much for that incredibly valuable input. But I think I'll structure it, instead of going through point by point of everybody's individual comments, of those that are the common themes I heard, and then some very specific points. So first of all, thank you very much for your support. What I heard underlying or explicitly from everybody was support for our project proposal and where we're going. In terms of common themes, it was overwhelming, the support for the responsibility of the auditor to be put into the positive and not just the limitations. And given that we think is the lead issue and absolutely vital, it was good to hear that. The second one was that there was a sense that making sure we have professional skepticism throughout the standard will be important. And I recognise that from experience, it's easier to say than do, but we will certainly do our very best to do that. The third common theme was a support for transparency, and appreciate that. It's once again, though, one of those difficult things as to how far we can go there. But I did like the comment that there are steps in the process, and that's a really good thought for us to take forward in terms of that work. And the fourth theme I heard was that there's a lot of good work out there, and you can be assured we intend to stay close to stakeholders and also mine that information from across the world, whether it's the COSO framework or whether it's the Accountancy Europe or whether it's other standard setters. We are going to use all of that work that's available to us. In terms of specific points, if I can run through those quickly, on technology, we'll certainly take both aspects of the technology, and the proposal is based on that. Next one, scalability. You will notice that one of the PIF qualitative characteristics is scalability. So we will certainly look at scalability both in the whether we're explicit, whether we have application material with examples, we have to make sure this is scalable. And one of the considerations we've already thought about, because there was call from some people that specialist skills were compulsory, that was patently not scalable. So we will we're already taking it into account and will continue to do so. Really liked the comment about remembering if you've got written representations to talk to the client early in the process, so they're expecting that. So that's part of the transparency and those steps that were talked about, which was valuable input. Clutch of issues around the ecosystem. And as I said in the presentation, we cannot focus on the whole of the expectation gap. That is just not possible. And it is our proposal that by strengthening 240, we will strengthen and improve the performance or delivery gap, whichever word you want to use. That's, of course, predicated on it being properly implemented. That doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to talk to all of the stakeholders in this ecosystem, including IFAC. And as a specific example, we've talked to the Education Committee about how we can actually improve education in this area. I've covered that one. 6. I think in terms of the LCE standard, and Bev, correct me if I'm wrong, it will predate the fraud standard. So there will be an update of the LCE standard in the frame or as conforming amendments, depending on which stage it's at. But they will catch up and work with one another. There were a couple of comments about what you do when you, to how you assess a fraud. And we certainly in the proposal talk about if there's a suspected or real fraud, that we need to bring all those procedures together. Currently, they're all scattered over 240. We need to bring them together. Then we need to stand back and look and say, is this enough? Do we need to do more? And we are proposing that we suspect that we will have to do more. And so we will do that. Another important part of that is connecting it with 250 on laws and regulations. So we make that connection between it being a suspected fraud and an actual legal fraud. So that is a part of the proposal. On estimates, thank you for that. It is a good example. I think we do mention 540 somewhere, but we'll put that into the considerations for examples at the complex end, because scalability has two parts, LCEs, but it also has the complex end. I've briefly covered specialist skills. You'll note from earlier presentations, we've moved from just forensic skills to general skills, because you could certainly see in complex estimates that you may need other skills than just a forensic expert. Finally, Jim, in terms of your two comments, we will obviously look to see if there are any old procedures we can get rid of. We have considered that and put it to the board in terms of some of them, for example, the third-party fraud and the, not the third-party fraud, sorry, the
rebuttable presumption
confirmations, etc. But each one of them's come back, so I don't know how successful we'll be in that. And the conflicting information is an important part of any audit procedure and of professional skepticism. So we'll certainly bear that in mind. So I think I haven't addressed every specific issue, but I think I've got most of them. So that would be my response to them. Hankin or Bev, is there anything you'd like to add?
None for me, actually.
Thanks, Hankin.
Not for me either, thanks.
Thanks. And Jim, if I've misunderstood anything or don't agree with anything I've said, I'm happy to talk about it.
Thank you, Lynn. I think you summarized that well. What I do sense, though, from the CAG, and sometimes we don't have consensus on any particular issue, but there seems to be a strong support for moving forward with this. So I think if anything, you should leave with that strong support. And thank you for taking your time to update us today. And we'll look forward to see where this moves.
Thank you very much, Jim. And can I just finish by thanking CAG very much for the thoughtful input throughout this process, and particularly for that support.
Thank you. And before I move with my closing remarks, I'd like to check in with Dr. Chen, the PIOB observer. Dr. Chen, do you have any comments you'd like to add?
So thank you, Chairman, and thank you all representatives. So the PIOB applauded on the progress the WG ever made so far on fraud project, and observed that the WG has been responsive to the PIOB's recommendations in conducting its work and formulating the project proposals. We support on those proposed project objectives to achieve the public interest, among which the first one might stand at the core, i.e. clarifying the role and the responsibility of the auditor for fraud in the audit of financial statements. Because that, as cited in the agenda papers, the introductory paragraphs in ISA 240 explaining that the inherent limitations of an audit can be misleading and result in misunderstanding of the auditor's obligations. So I agree on such comments. So subsequently, the appropriate definition of the role and the responsibility of the auditor for fraud in the audit of financial statements will be leading to how and to what extent the auditor will have to exercise professional skepticism and conduct audit procedures enhanced. So intensive deliberations on the role and the responsibility of the audit in this regard might be worth of the great efforts by the team. It is foreseeable that by the time the project completed and the revised standards being effective 3 years later or 2024, it will pose a big challenge for auditors arising from the increased responsibility for fraud in the audit of financial statements. Bearing in mind of the above, it might be helpful, along with the standard setting process, to stage effective educational courses too, and the dialogues with the auditor profession, so as for them achieving better awareness of progress of the project, as well as readiness for potential changes of their responsibility. So in conclusion, the fraud project is critically important in terms of responding to stakeholders' crucial concern, achieving high quality audit, and narrowing the expectation gap so as for better serving the public interest. We welcome the progress of the projects made so far and expect great progress in line with the timeline. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. That's consistent with our discussion, and it seems like we have some consistency here. Now I'd like to go to Tom to see if you have any final thoughts before we wrap up.
There's not really much more to add to that. That was really feedback and to some extent comforting because it was consistent with what we've heard all along and hopefully is reflected in large part in the project proposal. I'm also pleased that to hear from the PIOB that we're reflecting their public interest issues as well. Clearly, we will pay attention as we go along, but to us, there are guideposts going forward. So I think we really just are appreciative for all the CAG does for us, your input, and I appreciate your making special time with us today. And I hope you'll be following our deliberations next week, where I expect it's full steam ahead on this important project.
Thank you, Tom, and we will, because it's always helpful if we can be on the ground floor of these projects as they're kicked off. So thank you for that. Yoshi, I think I'm getting some feedback from you. And then finally, I'd like to mention that we do have our next CAG meeting, and that's going to be on March 8th through 9th, 2022. I can't believe 2022. And that is tentatively scheduled as a face-to-face meeting at this point in time. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for their comments. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today, and I look forward to seeing you at the next meeting. Have a good afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are. Take care, everyone.
Bye.